Hey everyone, it's Rob. And today, a quick note to let you know how excited the Leading with Genuine Care team and I are to share that our annual Mindfulness Leadership Retreat at the SMC Retreat Center in Red Feather Lakes, Colorado, is officially October 3rd to October 7th of this year. Registration is live, and you can find the link at donothingbook.com. Many of you may not know that I host a leadership retreat each year. Last year, unfortunately, we had to cancel it, so I'm uber excited for this year's event. And without question, this will be an impactful retreat for you. During your stay, you will learn more about meditation, mindfulness, slowing down, unplugging, and looking within from world-renowned meditation and mindfulness teacher Janet Sanchez. You will cultivate greater presence and awareness, which, as you know, is the greatest gift we can offer ourselves and others. You're also going to learn to tap into nature during a mindful hike led by SMC Executive Director Michael Gaynor. Patricia Karpus is going to lead us through a mindful connections exercise right by the fireside. And to top it all off, and this is truly an amazing experience, entrepreneur and tech pioneer Murray Hittery will lead us through his world-renowned mind travel silent hike. Now, all proceeds from the Leading with Genuine Care retreat go to support SMC and to help alleviate the impacts of the pandemic and a devastating fire that they had at their Cameron Peak last year. Okay, so please head on over to donothingbook.com and register for the retreat today. I promise you, you will not regret it. Why is self-compassion important? Well, today we are going to find out in my conversation with Kristin Neff, Associate Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She is a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research, conducting the first empirical studies on self-compassion almost 20 years ago. In addition to writing numerous academic articles and book chapters on the topic, her TED Talk has received 1.8 million views. She is the author of the book, Self-Compassion: The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. In conjunction with her colleague, Dr. Chris Germer, she has developed an empirically supported training program called Mindful Self-Compassion, which is taught by thousands of teachers worldwide. They co-authored the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, which I am an owner of and a fan of, as well as teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, a guide for professionals. Her newest work focuses on how to balance self-acceptance with the courage to make needed change. We'll be focusing much of our conversation today on her latest book, Fierce Self-Compassion: How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. Oh, and this isn't just for women, by the way. Okay, so please enjoy my chat with Kristin. Kristin, thanks for joining me today. I'm so grateful for your time.
I'm happy to be here, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
This is such a pleasure. I can't tell you. I enjoy your work so much, and I've followed you for many years. So to be able to, through the technology of this world, to be able to sit here and see you and chat with you, it means the world to me. I just want you to know that. I thought I'd start with a quote, and it goes like this, quote, "We can still be crazy after all these years. We can still be angry after all these years. The point is not to try to throw ourselves away and become something better. It's about befriending who we are already," unquote. That's from Pema Chodron. And I read this quote in your book, Fierce Self-Compassion. Great book. How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. And I'm just curious what comes to your mind when you hear that. those words.
Yeah, well, that's one of my favorite quotes, and really exemplifying the idea. And I think it's a widespread idea, especially with people who are on the path of mindfulness or compassion or contemplative practice. But the reason we practice is not to improve ourselves. It's not that we're unacceptable as we are, and we need to be more mindful, or we need to be more self-compassionate, or more together, or more balanced in order to be acceptable people. Right. So in other words, we are already acceptable just because we're flawed human beings.
Mm.
Or as another quote I have in there, the goal of practice is simply to be a compassionate mess. Right. So in other words, the goal is not to be perfect or to somehow reduce our messiness. The goal is really to be more mindful and compassionate about whatever's arising for us moment to moment.
Mm.
And so you really do shift your goal in terms of what you're after. So for me, I mean, I can honestly say this is not an exaggeration. After about 30 years of mindfulness and compassion practice, I'm still a mess, right? I still get reactive. I still get angry. I still say things I regret. Okay, I'm a little better. There's been some movement, but it's not nearly as much as you might like after 30 years.
Yeah.
But what I have really made movement on is my ability to hold that with compassion, right? Almost immediately, something comes out of my mouth. Almost immediately, I'm so sorry, I own it, what can I do to fix it? I can hold it, I can give myself compassion, but I can also have compassion for the person that maybe I was too blunt with or something like that. And that is an achievable goal, to hold the whole mess with compassion. Mm-hmm. And that's really what it's all about. The other stuff, again, it comes, and being compassionate is going to actually facilitate positive change more than shame or self-criticism. We know that from the research. But nonetheless, we're always going to be humans. We're always going to make mistakes. That is the path. That's fine as long as we own it and embrace it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you've been doing this for 30 years now. And can you talk about the work that you do as you're co-founder of the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, and you're on the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin?
Right. Yeah. And I'm actually taking early retirement end of this year at the university, because so much of my time is spent with the self-compassion work. It's like my professorship is my part-time job, which means, I probably can't give it the time and attention I would like to. But yeah, so really my life's work is spreading the word of self-compassion. Mm-hmm. I've done the research. I mean, I'll still do some research, but where I can be of most use now is giving talks, writing books, teaching workshops, helping people to become more self-compassionate. There's almost 4,000 research studies now on self-compassion. It's a whole field. It can take care of itself. It doesn't need me to shepherd it anymore.
Can you share a bit about your journey of, getting into this work and how it kind of got you so excited to keep digging deeper and be sort of a pioneer, really?
Yeah, well, so again, it started with me as a personal practice. I was in my last year of graduate school at UC Berkeley back in the 90s. And I was a mess. I'd gone through a divorce. It was a really messy divorce. I was feeling a lot of stress about, after spending 7 years to try to get my PhD, would there be a job? I mean, the job market's always tough, and it was very tough at that time. So I was just under a lot of pressure. And so I learned mindfulness meditation to try to deal with the stress. And luckily for me, there was a group that practiced meditation just very close to where I live down the street. And it practiced in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Zen master. And Thich Nhat Hanh is one of the Buddhist teachers who talks a lot about self-compassion. That's just part of his whole ethos. And so the very first night I went, the woman leading the group, along with teaching meditation, talked about compassion and about how we needed to include ourselves in the circle of compassion. And for me, that was really, revelatory. I mean, I kind of expected, it was a Buddhist group. I knew Buddhists were into compassion. That was kind of expected. But it had never even really dawned on me that we could also have compassion for ourselves, on purpose, intentionally, right? So I tried it out. I was going through a lot of stress. Again, I was feeling some shame and feelings of self-doubt about my broken marriage. And I just started being more supportive to myself. This is a really hard time, Kristin. It's going to be okay. I'm here for you. Everyone makes mistakes, or everyone goes through difficult times. It's part of the whole process. And when I did that, I was just so amazed at the immediate difference it made. I mean, mindfulness meditation took a while, took a few months to get the hang of it, but almost immediately I was able to turn toward myself with more warmth and kindness and understanding. And almost immediately I was able to see the benefits of it. So I was sold at that point. And then, you know, I did eventually get a job at UT Austin, and it took a few years, but in 2003, I published a scale to measure self-compassion and a theoretical paper defining it, right? So I didn't come up with the idea, but my contribution is probably that I kind of operationalized it and measured it so that we could do research on it. Yeah, and then people took it on from there.
So for when we're having self-compassion, and you say it kind of took off fast for yourself,
yeah,
and maybe you've learned through your studies for others as well. What does that mean exactly? And what exactly is going on, say, like in our minds, or even just the energy within us?
Yeah. And by the way, some people are, it's easier for us, some than others. Everyone can learn it. But some people, let's say you had very critical parents, or maybe had an early family, you know, trauma history, it's going to be a little slower journey for you, right? I was lucky I had a secure attachment with my mother, so everything was kind of, pumps were primed, you might say. For some people, when those pumps are, you know, damaged, sadly, because of their early history, it takes a little bit longer, but it can happen. But basically, so what happens is, often when we're upset, if we're stressed, or if we're feeling badly about ourselves, we're in a threat state, right? We feel activated. We feel like the threat to our self-concept feels like, you know, a mortal threat, because our mind doesn't really know the difference between our self-concept and our bodily self. So we feel like scared, we feel threatened. And so typically what we do is we turn the fight, flight, or freeze response inward. We fight ourselves, we criticize ourselves, thinking that somehow we'll change our behavior and make ourselves safe, right? Or we kind of flee into shame. You know, somehow if we shame ourselves and hide from others, and we're protecting ourselves from the perceived judgments of others. Or we freeze and we get stuck, right? In kind of rumination, we kind of think, okay, maybe if I just get stuck, maybe the problem will go away. So it's a very natural reaction to threat. And so what happens when we give ourselves compassion is we're moving from a threat state to a care state. So as mammals, we have the threat defense system, but we also have the mammalian care system. This is the system that's activated when we're with parents or close others, where we feel cared for, loved, connected, bonded. This is called the tend and befriend response, as opposed to the threat defense response, right? And so when we do that, just physiologically, it immediately changes. Our cortisol levels reduce, we increase heart rate variability, our bodies calm down, we don't feel so alone, we don't feel so threatened. And that makes a huge difference. And that's why it's so quick, right? But our natural response to threat for ourselves is the threat defense response, this fight, flight, or freeze response. It's funny, the natural response to threat to those we care about tends to be the tend and befriend response, right? So when our child or a good friend is hurting, we naturally respond with care. And so we're kind of doing a little hack, you might say, because like when your friend is hurt, you aren't threatened, so you can respond with care. But when you're hurt, you are threatened, so you respond with the threat defense system. So a lot of what's happening is actually just purely at the physiological level. And then you add in the thoughts and the way you frame things and the way you interpret the situation. And are you calling yourself names, or you're saying, it's okay, everyone makes mistakes? You know, that shift makes it just a huge, almost immediate, palpable difference.
Can you talk a little bit, just going back to your personal experiences? You've shared in the past, and you write about your son, Rowan. And I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about that experience that you've had in your life.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, thank goodness I had about 7 years of mindfulness and self-compassion practice when he got diagnosed, because that's very threatening, right? So as a parent, you expect one situation, we have one idea of what parenting is going to look like, and then your child gets diagnosed with autism, and immediately, are they going to be okay? Am I going to be okay? What do I do? There's so much confusion, and And actually, he got diagnosed just before I was scheduled to go on a meditation retreat. So I went on the retreat, and while I was there, I knew what to do because of my mindfulness and compassion practice, right? So first of all, I just made space for any feelings to come up. I didn't try to repress them. I mean, it's hard to admit that you feel disappointed that your child's autistic, right? Because you love that child, and you feel like, I'm not supposed to, but I was. I mean, again, I had one vision of what parenthood would be, and there was some grief and disappointment that it wasn't going to be like that. Plus a lot of fear about, the stress of it and would he be okay and all that. But I just allowed myself to feel all my feelings, and I supported myself, and I kind of, I felt my own support. In other words, I wasn't going to abandon myself in just caring for him or just doing all that. I was going to be there for myself, make sure I met my own needs. That sense of accompanying myself on the journey with warmth and kindness and support made a huge difference in my how stressed I was, for instance. And then what I found is, over and over again, when I got back and just throughout the journey with him, because he's doing great. He's 19 now. He drives. He's got a goatee. He's really well. But he also he gets stressed. He still has little freakouts. I mean, autism is comorbid with OCD and anxiety. So there's a lot of stuff. He's going through the normal adolescent stuff layered in with the other stuff. So it's even that much more intense. And so what I know is that when that comes up, the more self-compassionate I could be. First of all, it helps me stay calm, helps me support myself, and that helps him. It's almost like he partly regulates through my self-compassion practice. Now, sometimes I lose it. I get frustrated or I get freaked out, and then he immediately ramps up. So he forces me to be self-compassionate, because I know when I'm self-compassionate, it helps him. And when I'm not, he ramps up. So it's kind of like a feedback loop for me. But yeah, it's just made a huge difference.
Yeah. And you've shared a couple of stories about times in public where
Yes.
you've had to use this skill set, so to speak, or this tool in your toolbox. Can you share a story? Or?
Well, yeah. So I share this in my TED Talk, but it's a good story, so I could repeat it. One of the most dramatic times was on an airplane. And I think anyone who's a parent who's traveled has had an experience like this, when your child like tantrums on an airplane and you feel so horrible. But he was about 5 at the time. So there was the added layer of, thinking people were like, what's wrong with him? He looks normal. What's wrong with him? Why is he screaming? What's wrong with her? Why can't she control her child? So it was a transatlantic flight, and actually what triggered him was they turned down the light so we could get some sleep, and that for whatever reason startled him. So he went into a full-on flailing, screaming tantrum on the plane. And again, and I felt really bad. I mean, it was really disturbing. And here's everyone trying to get some sleep. So I was completely overwhelmed. What are my options? And then the only thing I could come up with was, I know, I'll take him to the toilet where he can tantrum in there. Maybe that'll muffle his cries. So, I took him down the aisle to the toilet, which was, of course, occupied, so that my clever plan failed. And so really the only option I had at that moment was self-compassion, right? So I put about 95% of my focus on myself. I made sure he was safe and everything, but I just kind of comforted myself. Normally I do self-compassion on the sly when I'm in public. I might just hold my hand, it's going to be okay, but no one knows. But I was rocking, and I was it's going to be okay. And, I was just flooding myself with it. And what I found is when I did that, he actually calmed down. That's how he calmed down, because we have a mirror neuron system. So I feel what you feel, and you feel what I feel. And autistic kids, they have a hard time perspective taking, but they're actually very sensitive, which is partly why they withdraw into themselves. So he and I were very attuned. And so when I gave myself compassion, then he was able to calm down. And then I was able to give him, more direct compassion. So stuff like that happened now. Even lately when he learned to drive, I told you he learned to drive. When you're making a left turn and your mother's felt it, and that would stress him out. So I would have to give myself compassion. I'm so terrified. This is so hard. But, I'm not the only one. All parents go through this. When I could stay calm, he could stay calm. So
that's so great. You mentioned your TED Talk, by the way, which I had to ask you this, but I can imagine I'm putting you in a funny position with asking you to answer it. But do you ever, I notice it has over 1.8 million people watched it. And do you ever think about that for a second? Where do you ever just sit back and go, I can't believe, almost 2 million people have watched this thing?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It is pretty amazing. I feel so blessed to have been able to positively affect people.
That's right.
Again, I'm just the messenger. It's self-compassion that does all the work. It's the idea itself that does it all. And people give themselves compassion. It's, other people are doing it for themselves. But I feel very privileged to be able to have been in a position where I can spread the good word, so to speak.
Yeah, and testament to those that are searching to understand this better and looking to somebody like yourself who has the knowledge base to put it in a way that can be understood.
Yeah.
When I'm curious, in preparation for this, I always talk to different people and try to get their perspectives and things they might be thinking. One friend of mine said to me, you have to be careful with self-compassion. Our purpose here is to be compassionate to others and have a little bit of self-compassion for ourselves. And not that she's an expert on any of it, but it got me thinking a little bit about, well, where is there a line or how does it work?
No, so because people misunderstand. I mean, there's so many myths about self-compassion. Whenever it says you need to have a little bit of self-compassion, I know immediately they're having these false beliefs about what it is. So first of all, the more compassion you give to yourself, the more compassion you have available for others. People think it's like, I only have 5 units of compassion. And if I give 3 to myself, I only have 2 left over for you. It doesn't work that way, right? So the more compassion I give to myself, the more I have available to give to others. So for instance, with healthcare workers, the more self-compassion they have, the less they're likely to burn out. Right. And even just for that very thing of the mirror neurons, the more self-compassion I have, the more I help you because your mirror neurons are reading my self-compassion and also you're modeling it for me. So that's a complete falsehood, false belief about that it's a limited sum. It's not. Now, it's true that time, right? We only have a limited amount of time. So what we find is in the research is self-compassionate people, they're more likely to compromise and make sure everyone's needs are met. So they don't subordinate their needs to those of others. Because if you do that, you're going to burn out, you're going to deplete yourself, and you aren't going to be any use to anyone. On the other hand, they don't prioritize their needs either. So it's like, okay, well, everyone's needs are important. How do we meet everyone's needs? There's a lot of other myths. People think that, again, they think it's selfish, it's actually the best thing you can do for other people to be self-compassionate, or they think it's self-indulgent. So self-compassion just means you want health and well-being for yourself. Well, can you really want too much health and well-being for yourself? Because, if you're doing something that's harming yourself, like, sleeping in all day or like giving yourself pleasure, well, then that's not self-compassionate, right? So by definition, you really can't have too much health and well-being. Too much means it's not healthy, which means goes against what self-compassion is. Right. And the other big thing is people think it's going to undermine their motivation, right? That they'll stop trying. Again, it's the exact opposite. It enhances motivation. But the reason you're motivated isn't to be an acceptable person. You're motivated because you care and you want to be happy. So, but it's really sad that there are so many myths about self-compassion because they get in the way of people practicing it.
And these things that you say, these come from studies that you've done and information that you've gathered.
Oh, yeah. No, there's research that shows clearly, without a doubt, that all these are false. It's not selfish. It's not weak. It's not going to make people also think it's weak. Combat soldiers with more self-compassion are less likely to develop PTSD. They're less likely to turn to alcohol. They function better. They're less likely to contemplate suicide as a way to avoid their pain. I mean, what self-compassion is a healthy way of dealing with the pain of life and the imperfection of life, including our personal imperfections. It's both, whether it's COVID or whether it's, you've done something that you regret, or maybe, you're unhealthy in some way. Maybe you're an addict, or, you're doing some behavior that's not healthy, which is painful. Or you're just like you're getting older and you don't look like you used to look like. And that's painful, especially if society says your value is, less you're valueless because you're older, right? So those things are painful. So self-compassion is a healthy way of dealing with the pain of life. Because really, there's no downside to it. By definition, there's no downside to it.
Mm-hmm.
and if there is, that you're just thinking about it the wrong way.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think when we were talking before we started recording, it does get me thinking a little bit back to when I started a mindfulness meditation practice 15, 20 years ago. And some of the things that you say that I'm hearing remind me of that time. You know, there's X number of studies and, you know, it's kind of coming more to the forefront and people are getting more curious and learning more about how they can incorporate in their lives. And so do you feel like this is a next kind of way that us in society, we can start seeing things differently and you have another tool for ourselves?
Oh yeah. So mindfulness and self-compassion, they go hand in hand. As a matter of fact, mindfulness, according to my definition, is part of self-compassion. You can't be self-compassionate without mindfulness. If you aren't able to be aware that you're in pain and have some perspective on it, so instead of like ignoring it and suppressing it or else running away with it, you know, you need mindfulness to say, wow, you're really having a hard time. What can I do to help? So, and they're, you know, and they're kind of two wings of a bird. And in fact, the research shows that even if you take a mindfulness course that doesn't explicitly talk about self-compassion, it raises self-compassion. And that's one of the reasons that it works. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the benefits of mindfulness meditation. Now, from my point of view, when you make it explicit, it helps, at least for some people. Some people, if the pump is primed for self-compassion, a little mindfulness, and then maybe it's fully there. But a lot of people, it helps to have a explicit practice to understand it, especially if you have beliefs blocking the way to self-compassion. It really helps to say, hey, it's not true. Here's the research. Here's the practice. Try it out. See what you think. But yeah, we're about 10 years behind mindfulness in terms of the research and how widespread it is. But we'll get there because, again, they really do go hand in hand. They're sister constructs. One without the other is incomplete. So, and some people, we've had some like 30-year mindfulness meditation teachers come to our courses and say, actually, this is different. This adds a dimension. It helps to do it explicitly.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
To me, you know, I back to mindfulness for a second. Mindfulness is really a simple concept, but it's hard.
It's abstract. It is.
Yeah, and you're right, actually, that mindfulness is simple, but it can be challenging because it goes against our other natural tendencies. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, so one of the difficulties with mindfulness is our brains did not evolve to be mindful, right? So our brains evolved to for our minds to wander, right? So whenever we have any downtime evolutionarily, it was adaptive to think about the past and the future and create a sense of self and to ruminate and to worry. And because those ancestors who did that were more likely to survive. So the brain naturally, the second you sit down to meditate, the default mode kicks in, which is kind of the default setting of the brain, which is creating a sense of self, projecting it into the past and future and looking for problems. That's adaptive. So the brain has a very strong negativity bias, right, which actually skews reality as a survival mechanism. And so mindfulness really works against that. I mean, it's not totally unnatural because we also have this big prefrontal cortex, and a lot of, especially as human beings, a lot of the real estate of the brain has structures that allow us to be mindful that maybe wouldn't be possible in someone without the prefrontal cortex we do have, right? But yeah, so we're fighting really against natural tendencies. Self-compassion, again, so it's a similar thing, right? So the threat defense response is the most natural reaction to any problem, either in our environment or in ourselves. And so you might say we're also fighting against natural tendencies to immediately go into fight, flight, or freeze. But in some ways, very hard to prove this. And I don't want to be too specific about some of the differences between mindfulness and self-compassion, because again, in many ways they're blended. But it's almost easier to access self-compassion for many people than mindfulness. And in fact, there's research that does show that if you give people a little self-compassion training when they start mindfulness practice, so yeah, your mind's going to wander, please don't beat yourself up. Try to be warm and supportive to yourself. Just like you might, if a little child wandered off from where they were supposed to be, you would just hold that child and usher them back with sweetness and kindness and say, hey, sweetie, you need to be here. You do that with your mind, so that type of self-compassion training, in some ways it's more familiar because we're so used to being compassionate and kind and warm to other people. Mindfulness, we aren't so used to ever being in that state. For many of us, it's pretty novel. I mean, there might be a moment when you're like enraptured by a sunset, but it's less a part of our everyday reality, mindfulness, you might say. Whereas compassion is more familiar. And that's why I think in some ways, for some people, it's actually good to start with self-compassion training first. Now, again, you need a little bit of mindfulness before you get into a state of samadhi, or, the mind really quiets and you get in states of full mindfulness. It's a little more challenging for many people.
Is there a mindfulness practice that you can do that incorporates self-compassion? I've had a challenging situation. I didn't handle something well with a, team member or a family member, and I'm just like rattled. Is there?
Well, yes. So absolutely. I mean, again, the two really do go hand in hand, and you always need mindfulness when you're self-compassionate. But so, for instance, in mindfulness practice, especially like if you look at MBSR, right, mindfulness-based stress reduction, there's a lot of emphasis on the body scan and developing the skill of what's called interoception, being able to feel what's going on inside of your body, because it's so useful for dealing with difficult emotions, which tend to overwhelm us. The storyline of, I can't believe you said that, or whatever. It's like we're off to the races. But when it's like, oh, clenching in my gut, and you feel it as a sensation, then you're more able to stay present with the difficult emotion. And so that's a mindfulness tool that's really also key to self-compassion. We always say, drop out of your head into your body if you can. So, with mindfulness, you might feel the clenching in your gut. You're so upset by what he just said. And then you put a gentle hand over that spot and say, wow, this really hurts. I'm here for you. I'm so sorry this happened. Changes things a lot. And so you're enhancing the mindfulness. You still have the mindfulness, but you're enhancing it with the explicit warmth and care. And that's really the magic ticket. That's really where it all falls into place.
So to do this actual practice of self-compassion, you're suggesting tapping into the body.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to, but it really helps. Really
Interesting.
helps. So for instance, one way we commonly induce self-compassion in experimental research is, and this doesn't involve the body, you don't need to, is you just write a paragraph kind of with mindfulness, you're validating your pain, being aware of it, this is difficult for me. Write a paragraph remembering common humanity, which is really key to self-compassion, that I'm not alone. That's the calm in the passion with suffering. It's with everyone else in the suffering. So you write a paragraph saying you aren't alone. It's not abnormal. There's other people who feel the way you do. And then the kindness, right? And that's effective. But what we find, and I wouldn't say we have hard data to support this. This is more just what we find in teaching workshops and my personal experience. When you move it to the body, it really empowers the feeling of self-compassion, because, again, what we do know from the research is it works on the level of the nervous system reaction. It activates parasympathetic activity, reduces sympathetic activity. So whenever you use like physical touch or focus on the body, it kind of more immediately works with the nervous system in a way that's quite effective. So
there's great exercises in your book. And I wondered two things about your book. The first is, what was the spark that led you to focus on women for the book?
Right. And, and I feel sorry for my male friends, because fierce self-compassion is for everyone. It's not just for women. But men and women tend to both be out of balance in their ability to what I call both fierce and tender self-compassion because of gender role socialization, right? So there's two sides of compassion that I talk about in the book. Tender self-compassion is more the nurturing, warm, gentle energy. It's about self-acceptance. It's okay, I'm here for you, the kind of the softer, more parental energy. But then there's also fierce self-compassion. In other words, to alleviate our suffering, sometimes we need to take action. We might need to protect ourselves. right? We may need to motivate a change. We may need to say, I need to do this for myself because it's really important for my happiness. We may need to take action like exercise or, going back to school, whatever it is that you feel you need. And so also social justice movements. Like I see Me Too and Black Lives Matter as self-compassion movements. It's a group of people standing up to say, hey, you can't harm us anymore. That's all about alleviating your own suffering, right? Mm-hmm. But they need to be balanced. I kind of use the metaphor of yin and yang. Yin might be the more tender, yang is more the fierce. We need both to be whole and complete, but gender role socialization messes everyone up. Regardless of gender identity, it's like people who are assigned male at birth, they aren't allowed to be tenders. They're called names, they're made fun of. And for a lot of men who are kind of naturally maybe sensitive, this really inhibits men's ability to be fully emotionally intelligent, to use the healing power of compassion. I mean, only like 15% of any people who come to my workshop are men. Why? That's just gender role socialization. The word compassion is like a female thing. That harms men directly. But women, on the other hand, aren't allowed to be fierce. They're called different names when they're growing up. If they're fierce, they aren't allowed to get angry. They aren't allowed to be too assertive or agentic. People don't like them if they do that. So everyone's out of balance. Everyone needs balance. But the book would have been too complicated to say, well, for men, it works this way, and for women, it works this way. So I decided just to write it for women, and also the history of patriarchy and oppression. Again, it works differently for men than women. But I want my colleague Chris Germer to write the book for men, which will read Tender Self-Compassion, how men can harness, kindness to, become emotionally intelligent and to heal from their wounds, something like that. But that's all. But I don't know what you felt. I've had a lot of my male friends say that even though it's focused on women, they still got a lot out of it. And the practices are relevant for everyone.
Yeah, I have a question here about that, because I wrote, the book is extremely applicable to me. I forgot numerous times that it was for women as I was reading it. Sometimes I paused because I was thinking a little bit about the fact that it was for women. And I would say, am I missing? I got to make sure I'm not missing something here, because I feel like this is really relatable to me in a large majority of it. So
well, that's good. And I've heard that, and I meant it that way.
Yeah.
At the same time, so partly the immediate spur for this book was the Me Too movement, and I had a personal experience. And I mean, it's still happening. Look with Governor Cuomo. I mean, we kind of almost lost focus of Me Too with Black Lives Matter, and maybe that's the way it should be. But nonetheless, all oppression needs to be addressed. And sexual harassment and the sexual objectification of women, it's a real problem. And so part of this book for me was just saying to my sisters, in particular, hey, we're raised to be compassion experts. Compassion doesn't just mean caring for others. I call it mama bear energy. We can turn this energy that we've been raised to give to our kids and other people and turn it inward, including saying no and fighting injustice and standing up for our rights and to be treated like human beings, not like sexual objects. That was the spur for it. But I'm glad you still got a lot out of it, because it really is applicable to everyone. And I was torn about how to approach it. But
so was it the personal experience that pushed it over the edge for you?
Yeah, I think so. Because my experience was there was an autism center that I had helped fund, and I was really part of it. And the man running it turned out to be like a mini Harvey Weinstein. And so many of the women who were affected by it, I noticed like they weren't getting angry, or they had such a hard time speaking up because we're so socialized. Don't rock the boat. That's just the way men are. And they realized part of the reason it happened is because this gender socialization is kind of partly designed to support patriarchy. That's part of the reason. There's a reason why women are socialized, just to focus on their kids and other people and not to complain about their unequal treatment. There's a reason women aren't allowed to get angry. It's all part of the process. And for me, it was a book to say, I want to be part of the social change. I don't want this to keep continuing. We all need, we're all unique. I'm not saying that men and women or people who identify as men and women need to be exactly the same, not at all. every single person should be allowed to be their full, complete, authentic self without society saying, you aren't allowed to do that and you aren't allowed to do that. I mean, that's just, and look at our planet. Partly it's because we've been cut off from this tenderness of care, and it's all about driving and achieving and conquering, and this having real ramifications. So again, I think this won't be my last book, or at least maybe other people will take it up. I do think it's for everyone, but this was a personal book really to help women say we need to harness what we're experts at, which is compassion, and use it for social justice and to say no and stand up for ourselves. That's why that's the focus.
I'd like to segue to anger, and that's a topic you write about, but you write about it in a positive way.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the gifts that anger brings us. Yeah.
And so this was also partly a motivation for my book, because women are socialized not to be angry. Men are more respected when they're angry. Look at like Brett Kavanaugh being elected to the Supreme Court. You know, he got really angry and people are like, yes, he's passionate. If a woman is angry, she's seen as crazy. Women aren't allowed to be angry. People are less swayed by a woman if she's angry as she expresses her opinion, and more swayed by a man if he's angry when he expresses his opinion. So there's a huge gender difference in how we relate to people's anger. And I naturally have a pretty short fuse. I get it from my mother. I come by it honestly. You know, it's like reactive anger is just part of my wiring. You know, like I say, over the years, I'm really good at apologizing. I'm a little better at not blowing my fuse, but it just seems to be my wiring. And I had a lot of shame around that. You know, here I am, a mindfulness and compassion teacher, and I'm still getting angry and, you know, woe is me. But then I realized, especially after this Me Too incident, this anger I should be grateful for it. The energy of this, you know, drive to stand up to injustice, to stand up for the truth, or to be focused on finding the truth, which is partly my scientist side, you know, and academia. There's a lot of kind of battles you have to fight in academia. And one of the reasons I've been able to do that pretty well is because of this fierce side. And I realized that I should not be apologizing for this. I should get down on my knees and be thankful to this side of me. Now, having said that, we don't want it to harm people. So anger harnessed for compassion, and there is such a thing, because compassion is the alleviation of suffering. Anger that's aimed at alleviating suffering, standing up to injustice, standing up for the truth, that's a positive thing. It's only when anger starts causing harm that it's negative. That's really the dividing line. There's nothing inherently harmful about anger. You know, it just depends on how it's expressed and what it's harnessed for. And so that was a real big journey for me. And again, using that mama bear metaphor, you know, because if you want to see someone angry, you know, you threatens a mother's children, and that it's empowering. It decreases the fear response. It helps us be very brave. It helps us be incredibly focused. You know, when you're angry, your mind isn't wandering. You're like a laser focused on the harm. So now, and by the way, I'm not saying it's easy to balance it. It's very difficult, and I get it wrong all the time, but it is our way. You know, we have to work with it as opposed to somehow think, you know, like the mindfulness movement. I think, you know, most mindfulness teachers will say it's fine to be angry, but I don't hear a lot of mindfulness teachers saying it's great to be angry as long as it's harnessed for good, you know, but it can be great to be angry. I mean, it's Black Lives Matter movement, global warming. If you weren't angry at global warming, there's a problem. If you aren't angry at racial injustice, there's a problem. We should be angry. We need to be angry, but not in a way that vilifies other people, that makes other people the enemy. You know, it's not angry at people, it's just angry at the problem with compassion for all the human beings, you know, trying to cooperate to solve the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's good. You share a formula in your book from a well-known meditation teacher, Shinzen Young.
Yeah.
It's suffering equals pain times resistance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. I don't think he would be offended. I was joking. He's like a Buddhist nerd, Shinzen. I sat with him before, and because and he actually says, actually, it's exponential, not a multiplicative relationship. So it's an exponential, it increases it. Yeah, but basically the idea that the more we resist our pain, the more the suffering, how much we suffer from that pain gets amplified. Now, this is all paradoxical. And this is also why I think we need to talk about fierce and tender self-compassion. Or another dynamic is kind of acceptance and change, which forms a paradox in our practice. So some people think because we know that resistance amplifies suffering, that we just need to be accepting. We have to accept the reality of the present moment. So for instance, if you don't accept the reality of racial injustice or sexual harassment, then that's a problem. But you can fully accept the reality and make space for it and allow yourself to feel it, while also doing everything in your power to change the situation so that the reality changes. But that's always going to be in the future, and mindfulness is always now. So it's this like kind of play, and the paradox is the more we accept the reality of the present moment, the more able we are actually to take steps to change future realities, with the understanding that we aren't in total control, which is wisdom, right? And so this is this razor's edge that we've got to, walk on on the path. But some people get confused and think acceptance, they confuse that with complacency. It's not at all, and there's been a movement in the whole mindfulness movement as well, that it's not okay for us to sit on our cushions and be healthy and well personally when the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We need to be active. We need to make change. And I think the fierce side, and by the way, fierce compassion, I didn't come up with that term. That's also in Buddhism. That's the term used, like Sharon Salzberg's been talking about it for years. That's a term used to describe compassion in its action-oriented form to alleviate suffering. And so I think it just helps to remind people that it's not all about acceptance. It's acceptance of the present moment while you're doing everything in your power to make change, with equanimity, knowing it's only we aren't in control.
And you talk about really big, important issues, but when I hear it, I also think about the less important issues that are big issues in our heads.
Yeah.
And it's so applicable. I think about leadership.
Yeah.
And how this can be utilized. Everything that you're saying, how we can frame that.
Well, yeah, and acceptance and change for leadership is really important, because what that speaks directly to is learning from failure and mistakes. So in the leadership context, there's been some stuff written about this. And for instance, Harvard Business Review has had a couple of big articles on self-compassion. Most people, they criticize themselves when they fail or make a mistake, or they use, they drive themselves harshly to achieve their goals, say in the business or leadership context. It's actually not nearly as effective as encouragement, which comes from compassion, which comes from care. And it's because people confuse care with complacency. They think that if you're kind, that means accepting failure or accepting mistakes. So first of all, you have to accept the reality that failure or mistakes occur, because they do. You can try to be superhuman, but everyone makes mistakes. Okay, so you have to accept the reality. When it occurs, it's happened. You may try to blame it on other people, but that's not helpful either. So wow, I really blew it. Okay, so you've got two choices when you realize you've really failed. You can shame yourself. Oh man, I'm so stupid. I'm not going to let this happen again. So you get all worked up. Well, that's going to lead to all sorts of performance anxiety. Part of your brain saying, well, what if I do fail again? Right? So it creates anxiety, or can create ego defensiveness. Shame prevents us from learning fully from the situation, because it's so painful. We can't just look at it honestly and say, hey, wow, that was spectacular. I really failed. Well, everyone fails. What can I learn from this? Oh, I see. I did this. And oh, that person did better. Instead of saying, oh my God, I hate that person, they did better. It's like, maybe I can talk to them and see what's working for them. Right. So when we accept failure and mistakes as just part of the learning process, and when we approach it with kindness and encouragement, then we're going to want to do better. Of course, we want to do better because we care. But it puts us in a mindset that maximizes our ability to learn and grow. And this is also when dealing with people that we're leading, right? If you just get angry at them or just, criticize them or shame them for not meeting your expectations, that's not really going to be a helpful motivator. But again, we need to be fierce. It's not all tenderness. There's got to be tenderness and fierceness. It may be saying firm boundaries. If you don't make your performance target, this is going to be the consequences. But also, I believe in you, and what can I do to help you? Instead of like, I hate you, I shame you, you better do better, or else. That's not going to really be effective. Again, this yin and yang, this balance of fierce and tender is so important, I think, especially in business contexts, because we tend to think of it only as fierce.
You write about the work being done by my friend, Jane Dutton. Shout out to Jane and her colleagues at the Compassion Lab at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. And, I'm wondering if you can discuss this movement to incorporate values and kindness and connectedness in the business world.
Yes, well, it's so important. And the data shows that it enhances the bottom line, right? So in other words, when people feel cared for by their employers, when there are systems in place to help those in need, when there are ways that people can be aware of other people's hardships so they can feel connected to them and offer their help, or at least offer their emotional support. When people feel cared for and connected, there's less turnover, there's less stress, right? People feel more committed to the organization. And that makes sense. Right? It makes complete sense. If you feel like you're part of a family as opposed to just some employer who's trying to squeeze the juice out of you, you're going to be more committed and more productive.
I love the way the gateway always seems to be, it improves the bottom line. But then I always think about it and I'm like, in business, isn't that just how it should be? We're just humans trying to do stuff. We're selling widgets. I mean, let's face it.
And it's also, it improves quality of life as well.
Yeah.
Really
we're here to lift each other up. It just seems obvious to me, but can you talk a little bit about relationships and why we feel we need to be in relationships to be happy?
Yeah, I think that's everyone, but it's especially for women. I mean, there's no really equivalent to old maid or spinster that there is for man. Men are allowed to be single. Women, their value is seen as somehow tarnished if they aren't desired and valued by a man or have a man in their life. I mean, that's something I've had to deal with, right? Because I'm single right now. And I've really had to use my self-compassion practice to say, well, my happiness isn't dependent on it. Yeah, it'd be great if it happened, but really committing to my happiness not being dependent on it, being able to meet my emotional needs, not only through self-compassion, but other sources through friendships or my work or things like that. But it's something our society tells us, and especially to women, because again, back in the day, women literally had no value without they couldn't own property. They had to have their father or their brother or their husband own their property. And so some of those vestiges have been left psychologically for women, that their value comes from being in relationship with a man. This is for heterosexual women, but this is, our whole culture is based on this premise. So that's one of the things, one of the real gifts of self-compassion practice is it gives us an unconditional source of worth and value. It's not dependent on a relationship. It's not dependent on how we look. It's not dependent on success. It's not dependent on anything. It's really intrinsic. It comes from just the fact that we're a human being, a conscious human being, intrinsically worthy of kindness and care. So it offers a real path to freedom. And also, so that's when you're out of a relationship. But also, if you're in a relationship, it also helps. It's not just helps one way. There's a lot of research that shows for people in relationships, if you aren't so dependent on your partner to meet all your needs exactly when and how you want them met, then you're actually more able to give in the relationship. So people are happier with self-compassionate partners. They say they're more giving, they're less controlling, more intimate. So in other words, the more you give yourself, the more you have available to give your partner.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel when it comes to happiness, just in general, even outside of our own, let's just talk about our own individual happiness, is our bar too high? I mean, are we trying to reach some sort of feeling that we have all the time? We're always happy and that's what we want and we grasp onto it. We don't want to let go. What's happening there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Clinging to positive emotions, right? So the glass is half empty and half full. Now, we do have a negativity bias. So in some ways, we need to use practices like gratitude or savoring to remind ourselves of what's good. It's funny because we want to be happy, and yet everyday sources of happiness we totally overlook, like the fact that we have hot water. Now, if you were in a third world country without hot water, if they installed a hot water system, you'd be over the moon happy. Right. And we just, plumbing, hot water, we don't even think about it. Right. So I think it's not so much that the desire to be happy, that's natural, the desire to be happy. It's our sources of happiness that are really skew.
Mm-hmm.
And then plus the fact that we don't have resources to deal with pain very well, unhappiness, which self-compassion, if it's anything, it's a resource for being with our pain in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. And here's the weird thing, compassion feels good. Even though it's a way of relating to pain, it feels good when our hearts are open and we feel connected, so it actually is a positive emotion aimed toward negative circumstances. It's not like sugarcoating, it's not positive thinking, but it's, that's hard. I mean, that's the tender form. Or it's like, no, that also can feel good. It's like, I'm strong, I'm standing up for myself. That also is a positive emotion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So. Just as we close out here, I was reading about a self-compassion workshop that you have starting in September. And yes. I'm just wondering if you can share a little bit about what one would learn going through this workshop.
Yeah, so this is an advanced workshop on fear self-compassion. And so we ask that people have some self-compassion training. Either you've taken some course through the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, or we've got a little, it's actually going to be online any day now, a little video you can watch, because it's good to have a foundation in tender self-compassion before you go really into the fear stuff, like dealing with things like anger or drawing boundaries. But it's a 6-hour workshops over 2 days, 2 3-hour workshops, where we really delve into this agentic fear side of compassion and how we can actually develop practices to help kind of engender this more yang energy, and again, balance with the yin energy through meditations and practices. And it's a lot of fun. So that's available in September. You can find about it at my website, selfcompassion.org, or the Center for MSC, which is kind of the training wing of what I do.
Perfect. And as always, we'll include all of that in the show notes.
Lovely.
Kristin, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me. This was such a thrill for me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Absolutely. And to all the loyal listeners, I greatly appreciate you spending time with us today. And as always, I wish you all much love and gratitude.